Case study time. Short-tailed shearwaters in the Great Lakes. Despite the fact that their range is nowhere near the Great Lakes, there have been a couple of very well-documented records in the last couple of years. So what is going on? So the common theory has to do with melting ice in the Arctic. So this yellow line is sort of where the average extent of the ice was during the peak of summer melting during these years. But in more recent years, you can see that it's really shrinking. I think it was maybe 20 odd years ago when theories were first put forth that birds like slaty-backed gull were making the jump across and hitting North America as sort of an explanation as to why they were occurring. Um, but yeah, other people started to wonder if species like short-tailed shearwater, which are abundant and really know how to fly, might also start ending up in weird places. There have been hints that something is up, but it really wasn't until last summer in 2023 when people started reporting hundreds of shearwaters, well into Canadian waters, that the possibility of them moving further and further really started to get on people's radar. And it was, this year, 2023, that the first confirmed record happened on Lake Ontario. Here we are now in 2024 with two records in a couple of days, and I thought I'm going to do a bit of a dive into what conditions preceded these records and try to get an idea of what maybe convinced them to end up in such a weird place. So if ice is the culprit, first thing I did was pulled up some of the ice maps. They're updated daily, and by the end of October, there was a lot of open water still in these areas that short-tailed shearwaters have been infiltrating. But over the next week or two, you can see that there was a rapid buildup of ice in this area. And the wind and the weather conditions at the time certainly would encourage any bird fleeing this part of the world to head southeast and maybe hit a place like Hudson Bay. That was interesting to me, looking at every day's weather, that there wasn't really any sort of front that would bring birds from the higher portions of the Arctic down into the lakes. So I do think there was maybe a multi-kick event happening here where birds ended up on this part of the world. And following the record on November 14th, Sky Haas in particular, sent this screen capture that he'd taken a few days earlier about this interesting wind event that happened on Lake Superior. And looking at the surface chart, you can see that pretty much the entire Ontario coastline of Hudson Bay and James Bay had wind that was light and relatively uninteresting, but was largely being funneled into a low pressure system over Lake Superior at the time. So this was a pretty sharp blast of north winds closer to the low that pulled air into Superior and then sort of cut quickly across the northern portion of the Great Lakes before heading off to the east. I think it's pretty interesting to consider that there wasn't really a push event if this is indeed where the birds came from. It seemed to be more of just a general suitable condition to leave and the concentrating effect of where that air aloft was funneling to that maybe dictated where these birds ended up. And this is all speculation, but another question in my mind is, if they've made this overland flight to the bay, why leave it again so quickly? Why make another overland flight? And I kind of wonder if maybe it has something to do with food. Like maybe they recognize that there's not really great food sources or foraging scrums out over these waters at this time of year. A lot of birds have left. So whatever it is, it seems like it was a motivating factor to leave even without a strong storm to push them. I think another sort of interesting thing that pops into my mind looking at all this is northern Fulmar, which is a vagrant but has been recorded several times in the southern end of James Bay, October, November, December, and there doesn't seem to be the same pattern into the lakes that short-tailed shearwater has shown the last couple of years. And I don't know if that's because they are actually occurring, maybe they're just staying way offshore, they're not being detected, or if short-tailed shearwater being in this flee from the ice, flee from whatever situation, was just ready to move again over land, whereas the Fulmar records do seem to be quite late in the fall and perhaps more correlated to when James Bay and when Hudson Bay really start to significantly freeze over. So yeah, I think the interesting takeaways for me is there does seem to be any number of routes depending on the weather or the ice conditions, which are highly variable year to year in this part of the world. When the ice forms, what direction the wind is blowing when the ice forms, that could, in theory, lead to short-tailed shearwaters escaping in various routes. And also, if there is at least some continuity around late October, early November being the time of year that this ice forms, if that means we might actually end up seeing a bit of a season around late October, first few weeks of November, when we might expect to see these birds separate from other northern species like Fulmar, which do seem to have a stronger correlation to late November into December, if they are indeed leaving James Bay and making their overland flights at that time. And I do think from a weather perspective, it's really interesting to note that it's not terribly common, I think, for winds from the bays to push into a place like Lake Superior. I would say most years around freeze up, or most years when there's big storms, it's very common to have a more westerly component to those winds. And I routinely think that the St. Lawrence and the East Coast is the route that a number of birds leaving this part of the world, sort of take and end up. So I do think it would be really interesting to see if future records of short-tailed shearwater materialize in this part of the world. With some hiccups possibly being once they hit the St. Lawrence or the ocean, what are the odds of them actually being detected by shore? Is it this sort of inland water body effect or fresh water that really continues to alter their behavior and convinces them to fly in places where birders might detect them? So I think it'll be really interesting to see if the wind and weather cooperate over the next several years to see if this is a consistent pattern or if it's going to be sort of an irregular pattern, and you need the stars to align in the north and there to actually be shearwaters displaced into this part of the world in the first place, or specific ice formations that lead to a cascading series of events where they might occur further and further away from their expected range. So I think it's going to be super exciting to see what happens. Yeah, that's all I got for this one. Let me know if you think I'm right or wrong, or if there's any cool ideas that I haven't thought of. Always like to hear more, and hope you have some great birding out there.